There's so much going on in this gospel, it's really hard to focus on one little thing, but I'm going to have to just for the sake of brevity. And that is, if you were here for the afternoon presentation, you already heard me say this, it's one little line. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains a single grain. But if it dies, it yields a rich harvest. My favorite images that Jesus uses for the reign of God have something in common. First one is the yeast in the dough. I think of all of them, that's my favorite one. The second one is the salt in the earth. And the third one is this one today, the grain of wheat. Think of those three things. The yeast in the dough, salt in the earth, and the grain of wheat that falls to the ground and dies. Think if you could think of what those three things have in common. Well, I get this from a very famous theologian named Hans Urs von Balthasar. And he says what these images that Jesus uses for the reign of God have in common are they all act by disappearing. They all act by dissolving. They all act by, in some way, dying. Jesus says that's what the reign of God is like yeast in the dough. Like yeast goes into the dough and it disappears. It dies, you might say. And when it does, it has this enormous effect on the whole batch of dough. It makes the whole batch of dough rise if it dies and disappears. It becomes part of the dough. It disappears into the dough. And when it does, it changes the dough from inside. What a marvelous image for the reign of God. But in some way, it needs to die to do that. It needs to lose its own integrity. Other than that, it won't work. Same thing with salt. And I suppose anyone who cooks knows it's really the same thing with most spices. You mix it into a recipe, and it dissolves, it melts. But when it does so, it changes the taste of whatever it's in. Hopefully it improves it. But it has to die in order to perform that function. It has to lose its own integrity. And that brings us to this image that Jesus uses today about the grain of wheat. The reign of God is also like this grain of wheat, like a seed. Jesus used that image quite often. Quote another famous theologian, Pope Benedict XVI, this little book he wrote called Jesus of Nazareth. He said that this line is the key to all Jesus' parables. How about that? And such an eminent theologian and Pope of the Church says a line like that, we better pay attention. He says this line sums up Jesus' parables, his teaching. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains a single grain. But if it dies, it yields a rich harvest. If it falls to the ground and dies, it somehow loses its own integrity. We're going to be focused more and more on Jesus' death as these days of Lent draw to their climax, and we celebrate the Holy Triduum, celebrate the Last Supper, the crucifixion, before we celebrate Easter. And we could easily get so focused on that, and I hope this doesn't sound too shocking to say it this way, we could get too focused on that in a sense and never really ask ourselves the real question we're supposed to be asking ourselves throughout this preparation for Easter. And that question we're supposed to be asking ourselves is, how am I supposed to die? What in me is supposed to die? What in me is supposed to dissolve so that I can bring new life? What in me has to die so that I can lead the dough around me to rise? What in me has to die so that I can give taste to everything around me? What part of me has to die so that my life can yield a rich harvest for the world? What part of me has to die so that I can be the presence of Christ in my world? It's a hard question. Tomorrow morning I'm preaching at the cathedral. Father Gerard said, it's going to be a children's mass. Make it simple. I'm like, I don't think this message I got is for kids. I think this is an adult message. What part of me has to die so that I can be like yeast, that I can be like salt, so that I can be a grain of wheat that falls into the ground and dies. Christ dying and rising is for our salvation, yes. But it's about more than that too. Christ dying and rising is also showing us how to live. And part of our living, you heard this hard word in the gospel today, is showing us how to die in all kinds of little ways. Not just the end of our lives, this is not just about going to heaven. All the little deaths we have to go along the way. And you'll recognize these. Dying to my impatience, perhaps. Dying to my unhealthy behaviors, perhaps. Dying to bad relationships that I need to get out of. Dying to my selfishness. Sometimes dying to the plans that I made for myself for the greater good of my community or my family, for the greater good of the world. Believing that we will rise. Not just after physical death, but daily, from every little death. None of these deaths are going to kill us. Because we'll become yeast in the dough. We'll become salt for the earth. We're going to yield a rich harvest with our own lives so that I can be yeast in the dough of my world, of my family, of my community, so that I can really be salt for the earth, bringing richness and flavor to everything around me in the name of Christ, so that I can be like a grain of wheat that falls into the ground and dies, but in doing so, yield a rich harvest for Christ in my world, in my community, in my family. Because the message of Easter is that death never is the final word. The big death, all the little deaths. United to the Spirit of the risen Christ, death never has the final word. Death never wins. Life always wins. Now there's a whole teaching here based on that point of von Balthasar concerning the church. What does this mean for the church to act by disappearing? We don't have time for that whole thing here, but it's a good question to take with you. What does it mean for the church to imitate Christ in this way? But for now, and for us today, let's just sum up simply by saying, you see, the whole point of Easter is that death does not have the final word. Like Jesus rising from the grave, in the midst of all these little deaths we have to go along the way, my real self, hidden with Christ in God, shall not, does not, cannot die. We're united to the Spirit of the risen Christ. Instead, if I allow the shell of myself, the husk of my outer self to dissolve, to melt, I will live with the Spirit of the risen Christ, pulsing through my veins, bringing me a joy far beyond anything I could measure, anything I could have imagined, and making of me another Christ, a gift to the world.